You're good to go.
All right. Hey, y'all. How are you doing? This is Daryl from the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, and we're going to talk about some of Robert E. Lee's chaplains today and take a little bit of a dive into the world of the chaplains, think a little bit about their backgrounds, their training, their social backgrounds, and then their service in the Confederate Army during the war. And for me, actually, the most interesting component of this conversation is going to be about their post-war careers, because these men end up being significant leaders in their respective denominations in the years after the war. And that seems to be the case with a lot of Robert E. Lee's chaplains. These are very well-educated, well-placed, wealthy, in many cases, individuals who are leading the religious effort in Robert E. Lee's army during the war. But before I get really going on these three fellas, I want to talk a little bit about some contours and some patterns that you see in preaching and camp religion, because I think most of us are familiar with the idea, the lost cause idea, that Robert E. Lee's army was a particularly religious army, that it was led by pious men. A lot of that is promoted by a fellow that we'll be talking about later on in the week with Dr. Chris Graham from the American Civil War Museum. J. William Jones, the editor of the Southern Historical Society papers, was one of Lee's chaplains during the war, and became very good friends with Lee before he died. He was even the chaplain at Washington College while Lee was the president. And so a lot of what has passed into the historical memory of religion in Robert E. Lee's army is seen through the lens of the lost cause and for the promotions of J. William Jones. For those of you who are members of the museum, you can go over to our member portal and read a short essay that I wrote last week about a fantastic new book by Dr. Chris Moore about J. William Jones. It's long overdue. It's a really, really fascinating read that deals really nicely with Jones's wartime service and then his post-war career as a Confederate apologist. So for members, go over to the member portal on our website and take a look. It's pretty interesting stuff and a great book. But when you were thinking about these patterns in church history and the camp religion in Lee's army, I think it's really important to remember that the southern states, the slaveholding states, come to evangelical religion late. The more religious part of the early republic was Puritan New England. The Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, especially in New England, and later the Baptists. The South learned from Northerners how to become evangelicals in the early part of the 19th century. And it was a real struggle. It's not until the 1820s that you see large majorities in the slaveholding states attending churches, being members of churches. So that's an important thing. 1820 to 28, 32 is about the window when the South becomes really evangelical, and they become evangelical in a very specific way. First off, they're very denominationally particular. It's almost like a blood sport, watching the debates between the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists about the correct forms of baptism and other types of theological divisions. But one thing that did unify all three of those denominations is the pro-slavery theology that had begun to develop in the late 19th or late 18th century, and really has become a mature way of reading the Bible, an exegetical foundation for how Southern ministers read the Bible, how they preached. And this becomes, by the 1820s, it's become a pretty significant theme within the church. And by the time that these men who become the leaders of camp religion in Lee's army are being trained, It was the consensus opinion amongst the main denominations, again, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the Methodists. Very well articulated, a literalist reading of the Bible. They find texts that support slavery. They find negative spaces in the Bible. They argue that had Christ really wanted to do something about slavery, he could have said something, and there's nothing in the Bible that says that's the case. I've got a notice here. Pete's in the control room right now. I've got a notice that says my speaker's not working. Is that the case?
You're breaking in and out just a little bit, but I can still hear you.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to continue on, and perhaps we can make some sense.
Yeah, you sound a little bit better now.
Okay. Well, maybe I should talk. Just move up and talk louder. In any case, this pro-slavery theology is taught in the seminaries, taught in the universities and colleges in the South, and it really is amongst the educated elite of the slaveholding states the primary way of understanding and reading and explaining the Bible. So that's not to say that there were other traditions and interpretations. When you get out of the slaveholding districts, you do see some resistance to that pro-slavery theology. That's not significant in a cultural sense in the ways that it sort of lays this blanket of understanding across the South. So these guys, and one of the things that's interesting is I've gone through my research and dug into the lives of these ministers in my studies, is that they're from elite backgrounds. They are all of a very similar generation, born about 1834 to 1840. So they're young men when the war starts, and like many of the political leaders of the secession movement in the Deep South, these guys have a future to look forward to, and they are casting their lot with the Confederate nation, and they're casting their lot with the Confederate government and the Confederate Army. So they're pretty staunch secessionists by and large, though particularly amongst Baptists, it was kind of frowned upon to talk a whole lot about politics. But that doesn't mean that they didn't, and it doesn't mean that when secession happened that they didn't go in full force, whole hog to the Confederacy. That's exactly what happened. There's a really wonderful diary left by professor now at Mercer Institute, Prince Mercer University, the Baptist College in Georgia, that he's bemoaning the division in the end of 1860. He's concerned about politics. He's concerned that there's going to be a rupture between the North and the South. But he records the day of Georgia's, in his diary, records his recollections of the day that Georgia votes to secede from the Union, and he says he hears bells ringing and people are excited. And within a week, he's actually conducting drill for the young men at Mercer Institute, who then go off and join the Confederate Army. So, and he becomes a strong Confederate apologist, and that gets us kind of to these patterns of preaching and what people are hearing during the Confederate period. From the end of 1860 through 1865, and when you start looking at the sermons that are being preached, I looked at probably 120, 130 sermons, and looked for patterns of preaching, and they're pretty clear. Early on, when these soldiers are going off to war, there's a lot of talk about the rightness of the cause, the rightness of the Confederacy, the connection between slavery, God's will, and the Confederacy. And there's a lot of talk about duty, about protecting community, and that's a very predominant way that ministers were helping coalesce the this Confederate identity and beginning to build a uniquely Confederate identity in 1961. It changes fairly subtly through the end of 1861. You end up beginning to see a lot more conversion preaching going on. It's almost like William Jones said, it was you could almost not tell the difference between the kinds of sermons that were going on in Lee's camps or the Confederate Army's camps. Lee's not in command yet. In these camps, you couldn't tell the difference between your regular home church and the preaching that was going on, because the thing that Jones and these other young men recognized is that these young impressionable men could be convinced to become church members and go through a conversion experience in these moments of stress. And they saw, all of these chaplains saw the Army as a mission field. And in fact, fellow I want to talk about in a little while was very deeply involved in missionary work, Crawford Toy from the 53rd Georgia. But in any case, you begin to see this shift was conversion preaching. And you also begin to see shortages of chaplains. There are not enough chaplains to cover all of the regiments in the Army that's serving in Virginia. Never in the course of the war were there more than half of the regiments covered or had in their ranks a chaplain. Now the Baptists particularly were really interested. They in fact, the Baptists were not in favor of having military chaplains that were paid by the government. They thought that was against their notion of the separation of church and state. They emphasized Army missionaries, Army evangelists. J. William Jones becomes an Army evangelist later on in the war, and those guys could move around in the Army, and they could preach in multiple brigades and multiple regiments. But there was a definite shortage of preachers during the first part of the war, and that starts to change. By the end of 1862, the denominations have gotten a little bit better organized and are beginning to promote or to send men to the Army to preach. They're sending evangelists to the Army to preach. They're pushing the government to pay the chaplains better. And interestingly, the Confederate government got slow to really organize chaplain corps during the first year and a half of the war. The duties were not particularly well defined. There was never a uniform regulation for chaplains issued by the Confederate government. The debates that were going on in Congress about how to pay these guys drags all the way through the end of 1861, and they're trying to cut salaries as much as possible for these men. They end up being paid about the wage of a second lieutenant. And held rank analogous to the captain. Though you see photographs of chaplains with captain bars, and you see them with majors and lieutenant colonels insignia. So not a tremendous amount of oversight by the Confederate government as to what's going on. And that left a lot of confusion in camps. The chaplains, what are their duties? It's a pretty loose and especially through the first year and a half or so of the war organization. But by the end of 1862, you're starting to see a much more formalized organization. Beginning of 1863, in Jacksonville, or you see a chaplains association that's organized that helps to create some informal rules about how these chaplains are supposed to operate. So, and at that time too, enough chaplains have gotten into the camps, and the publication wings of the churches have gotten up and running, and they're sending tremendous numbers of tracts, especially after the Sharpsburg battle. You begin to see some increasing interest in religion, more successful revival, from the promotion of revival, and some people see this as a sign of the soldiers getting a little bit more serious about what's happening to them. They're responding to the combat of 1861 and 62, and they're also responding to the deaths of men in camp from disease. And so religion, Jones says that religion was not especially attractive to a lot of these young men early in the war. But by September, October, end of September, after Lee's army gets back across the river and goes into camp in Virginia, you begin to see revivals kick off, and they're only really interrupted from the end of 1862 to the end of the war. They're only interrupted by campaigns, and they pick right back up after the campaigns end. And during this period, you really see an emphasis in the literature that's coming out of the denominational press, this emphasis on conversion, this emphasis on a redoubled interest in conversion and keeping men in the Army and training particularly religious characters. Now, that's not to say that that's the only kind of preaching that's going on, because there is some political content that begins to drift into some of these sermons as the war goes on, especially in moments of crisis. On Saturday or on Sunday, Dr. Graham and I will be talking about that. I'll be talking about a specific sermon given by the chaplain of the 10th Alabama to the men of Wilcox Brigade, and Chris will be talking about the convention that's held by the denominational leaders of the Confederate churches down in Richmond, the document that was produced. So, but that political, that nationalist, the racial components do appear in these sermons from time to time. And again, in these moments of crisis, say after Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Tullahoma campaign, when there are serious threats to the Confederacy being made visible, there's not quite a return to that nationalist preaching that you saw early in the war, but certainly very tactical applications of that. And you see it through the end of 1863 and all the way through 1864. It becomes a little bit more, issues of duty become very important themes within the sermons and the lead up to the Overland campaign and in the trenches in Petersburg. So you have conversion and stay in the Army, do your duty, don't be Judas. I mean, these are themes that you see in preaching in 1864. So those are kind of the general contours of the kind of preaching that's going on. But there are three guys I do want to come back around to, because all of these stories are rooted in people's lives, and that's something that we need to take very seriously, both as producers of religious ideals and consumers, people in the congregations. There's a conversation that's going on. There's a conversation that's going on with the people back home, and expectations of religious duty and religious obligation that you see in letters from family members, parents, from wives, from sisters, and it's just there's an urging on the men to be serious about their religious duty and their religious lives. And some of the guys who helped do this in the camps are some interesting characters. The first I want to talk about is Thomas Dwight Witherspoon, who is, a Presbyterian. He's the chaplain of the 42nd Mississippi Davis Brigade. So he's right here at the seminary on July 1st, around the seminary on July 1st. And he comes from Greene County, Alabama. He was the son of a wealthy family. Greene County, Alabama is one of the counties in Alabama with the highest percentage of slaves, enslaved people in all of Alabama. It is most certainly in the Black Belt of Alabama. It is cotton producing plantation south. And Witherspoon grows up in that environment, and he goes to the University of Mississippi, and he graduates and then heads over to Columbia, South Carolina to study at the Columbia, South Carolina Presbyterian Seminary. And he studies with men who are very vehement pro-slavery apologists, and he studies that very, very carefully. Fortunately, we know a good bit about Witherspoon. He leaves a pretty rich documentary trail. One of the things that I found most interesting about he's a very disciplined man, so he takes copious notes, and he leaves a very detailed sermon log. After he goes back to Mississippi, he ends up is the minister at the Presbyterian Church there in Oxford, Mississippi. He goes back to where he went to college and leads that church for a couple of years before the war. And while he's there, he obviously is giving sermons. He's obviously leading Sunday school classes. He's doing the everyday kind of work. He's writing and publishing some, and becomes much more prolific in his publications after the war is over. In fact, some of his publications are still in print and used by some of the more conservative churches in the Presbyterian tradition today. But Witherspoon leaves a very detailed sermon log in which he notes the text that he draws his sermon from, a short description of what he talks about. And all through 1859 and 1860, you have it's the regular kind of stuff. But what is interesting about this is that he makes special note of the sermons that he preaches for the enslaved people who were either members of the church or who were attendees of the church. And so he would do special sermons for enslaved people. This is not something that's uncommon. It's something that you see in the WPA slave narratives, for example. And the theme seems to be pretty consistent across the slaveholding states. And the instruction was this: servants, obey your masters. Every one of the sermons that Witherspoon notes in his sermon log in 1859-60 that were directed to enslaved people had some sort of theme of obedience, of subjection, of duty to live out your lot. And Witherspoon was not like many Baptist, Presbyterians, Methodist ministers who gave that kind of instruction. So Witherspoon is right in the center of this pro-slavery theology. It was a part of his social life. It was a part of his intellectual life. It was part of his schooling, and it was how he led his congregation before the war. When the war breaks out, he joins the 42nd Mississippi, and he serves as a private for a while. And this is something that happens fairly commonly. And as the war goes on, you see a lot more of this, of men who are in the ranks going home to be ordained or being appointed through the ranks to become a chaplain, which is an interesting theme that we haven't really dug too deeply into yet, but we're on the path of that. But in any case, Witherspoon joins the Army early on in the fall of 1861. It goes off to war with 42nd Mississippi. He is with the regiment pretty much nonstop through the Battle of Gettysburg. And at Gettysburg, of course, Joe Davis's brigade gets involved in the nasty fight over the railroad cut, take very serious casualties, and then are driven back towards First Ridge. And we also know that on the third day of the battle, Joe Davis's brigade is part of the Pickett Pettigrew Pender Trimble attack. And evidently, and this is one of those places where the duties and the obligations and the service of a chaplain during battle becomes kind of cloudy. By all accounts, including his compiled service record, Witherspoon picks up a gun and he fights. And most likely fights in Pickett's charge portion of the combat here at Gettysburg. But the next day, he reports in one of his memoirs, published in the Southern Historical Association's papers, or Southern Historical Society's papers, is back at the hospital, helping tend to the wounded men. So he's doing the more common work of the chaplains by the 4th and the 5th of July. He notes he remembers watching the Confederates retreat. He elected to stay with the wounded men. He's one of those chaplains who were left behind at Gettysburg. A number of surgeons and a number of chaplains stayed behind to help tend to the Confederate wounded. And Witherspoon is one of those men. And when the colonel of the 42nd Mississippi, who is being treated in a private house in Gettysburg, is dying, he calls for Witherspoon, and Witherspoon goes to him with his son, with Colonel Humor's son, and is with Colonel Miller when Miller passes. The story he tells that Witherspoon tells later on in life is pretty interesting. When he agrees, he gets permission to accompany Miller's body back to or over to Baltimore for shipment to the South for burial. And he gets to Baltimore, and he has a run-in with with Schenck, who's in command of the city, finds himself imprisoned, and the body is in a tomb in a mausoleum in Baltimore. And he has a very interesting exchange, or is witness to a very interesting exchange between one of Schenck's aides and Schenck himself. And when Schenck says, "Put these guys in the jail," the aide says, "We can't do this. This man is a minister. He's a minister of the gospel. We can't throw him down here. This is where the refuse of the army is. This is where the drunks are, where the pickpockets and the thieves are. We can't put this man down here." And Schenck says, "Yeah, we can. And the reason we can is because these guys are the reason for this war. That if we hung a few more of these chaplains and these religious leaders of the South, we'd go a long way towards ending the rebellion." Witherspoon stays in prison for some time, ends up at Fort McHenry, and then at the end of 1863 is exchanged along with most of the other chaplains who'd been left behind and the surgeons who'd been left behind at Gettysburg. But between August and November, he's a prisoner of war. He doesn't go back to the Army immediately. He goes back down to Mississippi, evidently. It's kind of a blank spot in his experience. He goes back down to Mississippi, evidently goes back down to Mississippi and does come back to the Army until the middle of 1864. And he stays with the Army until the end and is at Appomattox and surrenders with the regiment there. After the war, he goes back to Mississippi, but he moves around some. He goes to Memphis, Tennessee, and has a big congregation there, becomes the chaplain of the University of Virginia in the early 1870s, and then later in his life is the minister at First Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Also teaches at a seminary there in Louisville. He teaches Christian evidence at the Central University of Kentucky, and then he becomes the professor of homiletics and pastoral theology at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary in the late 1890s. And he leaves a tremendous trail of theological writings and influences a whole generation of Presbyterian ministers in Kentucky. And the thing that is important to remember is that he identifies in his diary, he identifies himself as an unreconstructed rebel, and continues to advocate for slightly different terms for the whole pro-slavery theology. And the war ends, but these guys' theology is still the same in many, many ways. You see this in sermons, you see it in letters, and in some cases you see it in the marginalia of individual Southern Bibles, writing about the war. The war didn't change things. It literally, one Gwinnett County, Georgia, that I read many years ago. This is how it is, and this is how it will always be. So the soundness of that theological construct is pretty resilient. It goes through the war and it continues on at least through the end of the 19th century. So these guys have a lot of experience, a lot of influence over how the post-war South sees itself and how it understands itself. Witherspoon is an unreconstructed rebel. J. William Jones is a leader of the Lost Cause move. William Bennett from a Methodist minister who's in the Army of Northern Virginia, the same kind of thing, promoting this lost cause vision of the war. So they become very, very influential and very important leaders in the post-war South. And they keep that cultural and that religious and theological idea rolling along. So Witherspoon, very interesting fellow. There is a photograph of him while he is here in Gettysburg, and we'll be sharing that over on the member portal shortly. So,
I can post that in the comments as you're talking.
Comments? Sorry, I got cranked up. I got.
Yeah, no, I'm going to post that in the comments now. The picture
Yes.
of Withers. I'll post the picture of all three of them. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So, all right. Next fellow that we want to talk about is Peter Tinsley. And Tinsley is the chaplain of the 28th Virginia. Excuse me. He's an Episcopalian, and he is a pretty well-placed guy. He's from Louisa County, and is Powhatan County, Virginia. Louisa County is where J. William Jones is from. Tinsley goes to Hampton, Sydney, is a pretty accomplished scholar there, and becomes friends with James Kemper and a lot of the Virginia political elite of the late antebellum period. And at Gettysburg, he has a great diary that we have a copy of here at the museum. And the reason that this is interesting, that this guy, he's particularly interesting, is that he's in the seminary building. He's in the building that's now the museum, tending to some of the wounded Confederates after the hospitals were all concentrated. So he's a very articulate guy. He is very much of that upper echelon of Virginia society. He has very patriarchal views about how women should be acting. He's absolutely mortified by the volunteer nurses and what he calls she-doctors who are in the Gettysburg area. He's mortified that they would lift their skirts up to walk over wounded men, that they would be acting like doctors, giving orders. And in fact, he leaves a pretty specific description of Dr. Mary Walker on the battlefield, which is a fascinating insight. It's clear that he's talking about Walker. He talks about a couple of other women who he encounters. A woman from Chambersburg who's over, and he's very, very unhappy with the way that she's behaving, giving orders to men, and that's just not something that you do in the genteel realms of Virginia society. So he leaves some really interesting insights into that. And he leaves a very, very touching and very affecting description of what happened right before Pickett's charge. He said, "We said a short prayer, sang the doxology, and I closed with the apostolic benediction. How sincere and fervent must have been those prayers. By all probability, we knew that it was our last." And that's from his diary on July 4th, recounting what had happened the day before Pickett's charge. When the battle ends, he ends up out at Bream's Mill, the Black Horse Tavern area where Pickett's division's hospital was. There's no evidence of him participating in the battle. Obviously, he's performing his pastoral duties by his own diary's account. And we do know that by the 4th and the 5th, he's back over at Bream's Mill, and he's tending to the wounded. And he's particularly helping James Kemper. And he stays with Kemper. He does go out on the battlefield and look for wounded men, but he evidently spends most of his time at that hospital at Bream's Mill and spends most of his time there with Kemper. And he describes Kemper's removal from the field hospital to Seminary Hospital as the United States Army begins to concentrate the hospitals across the battlefield. And Kemper's not happy about this. Kemper seems to have been pretty well set up. He did not want to be under United States Army control, and he resisted at least successfully once his removal to the Seminary Hospital. But eventually he has to move, and Tinsley comes with him and spends some time in the building itself. And he leaves a really interesting makes some very interesting observations about the Pennsylvania militia that take over the guarding of the Confederate prisoners who were in the Seminary Hospital. Because when the Union Army's provost marshal pulls out the 5th or 6th of July, the Pennsylvania militia, the emergency militia, takes over the guarding duties. And Tinsley refers to them as blockheaded Germans, illiterate, uncouth, dirty. Anything that you could say bad about a human being, Tinsley says it about these guards, and he tells a story, and it's not apocryphal. It's something that comes out of the diary. It's not something he's remembering years later. There's a group of women who come into the hospital from Baltimore, and they want to see Kemper, and they want to see Isaac Trimble, and they want to see Henry Kidd Douglas, who are all in the building in the hospital recuperating. They want to see the Colonel of the 5th Texas who's here, and in fact the Colonel of the 5th Texas and Henry Kidd Douglas are in one room, and Kemper and Trimble are in another, an adjoining room. And the women come to see Kemper and Trimble, and they visit for a while, and they say, well, we're going to see Henry Kidd Douglas, and the German guard refuses to let him pass. And according to Tinsley's diary, Trimble pulls a knife on the guard and forces him to allow the women to go and see the patients in the other room. So some really interesting insights into cultural assumptions. One of the things too that I thought was really interesting about Tinsley's diary is, and this kind of gets back to this notion of theological divides in the South before the war and how they continue through the war. He's at the hospital. It's either the 4th or the 5th. He's at the hospital, and he writes in his diary that night. He said, "How could anybody believe in Calvinism? How could anybody believe that God authored this suffering? How can you accept that?" Which I thought was, I think it's an incredibly interesting insight into Calvinism and Arminianism and theology, and how it plays out in practical terms, and the kinds of questions that come out of the wartime experience. Tinsley, after the war, ends up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he takes a little bit of a different path than Witherspoon. He goes to Cincinnati and becomes the rector at the Church of the Advent, beginning, I believe, in 1871, and he stays there until the 1890s when he dies, and then his body is taken back to Virginia for burial. He was much beloved by the congregation. You can go in the Church of the Advent's Facebook or web presence, and you can see a tremendous outpouring of affection for Tinsley. He turned the church into something of a powerhouse in Cincinnati. Ministered to the business elite of the town, tripled or quadrupled the membership over the course of his leadership, and is still seen as a really important character in the history of that church. So now I want to talk about the strangest chaplain that I've come across in looking at these leaders, and Crawford Toy. And Crawford Toy is from Norfolk, Virginia. He was born 1836, went to the Southern Baptist, went to the University of Virginia, and then the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was roommates with J. William Jones. Jones kind of weaves in and out of the story in very, very important ways across time, both during the war and then after. But he and Toy were very close. Toy and J. William Jones were roommates at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and remained friends through the war and beyond. Now, both of these men, both Jones and Toy, wanted to be missionaries, and in fact, they had gained financial support, to go to China to become missionaries in the latter part of 1860. Both are very concerned with what's going on politically, and the Southern Baptist Convention decides at the end of 1860 that they can't send these guys out. Politics are too threatening. The financial side of things is too threatening. We don't know if we can support you. And both Toy and Jones ended up staying. Toy they were ready to go. They had their bags packed in September, and then the Southern Baptist Convention stopped them from going. Toy, I don't know, there are probably a few Southern Baptists out there who are familiar with Lottie Moon. And Lottie Moon and Crawford Toy were engaged during this period. Or during the wartime period. Moon is one of the most famous Southern Baptist missionaries in history, and they still have a Christmas offering that is named after Lottie Moon. I mean, her influence is very deep, and she and Toy were engaged to be married. They were going to go off and do their foreign mission work together. But the war intervened, and then Toy's intellectual curiosity kind of torpedoed the entire relationship. That's getting a little bit ahead of the story. We don't know a whole lot about Toy's wartime experience. We do know that he ends up as the chaplain of the 53rd Georgia, and he is at Gettysburg. We don't know a whole lot about what he does at Gettysburg. We do know a lot more about what happens after the war, which I think is incredibly interesting because he is about as far out on the left wing by 1870, theologically and intellectually as you could be. That creates all kinds of problems for him. The war ends, and Toy, within a year, is in Berlin, studying at the University of Berlin, and becomes a follower of Darwinian thought, and he becomes a fan of biblical criticism. And if you know anything about what goes on in the modernist fundamentalist debates in the late 19th century or 20th century, the whole idea that you can look at the Bible as a text, as a historical text, is a real bone of contention for the people who describe themselves as fundamentalists. But Toy becomes an advocate of that broader way of reading the Bible, and looking at Scripture. After he finishes at the University of Berlin, he comes back to the United States. He gets appointment at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and holds that post until the beginning of the 1870s, when he really runs afoul of the board of directors and the faculty at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He denies some very important Christological implications and theological ideals that were central to Southern Baptist thinking. He kind of rejects the whole idea of typology, where the Old Testament is preceding and anteceding the story of Christ and the New Testament stories. And it becomes a very big issue, a very public issue. And in 1871, Toy resigns from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He leaves and gains an appointment at Harvard, teaches at Harvard for the rest of his life, and becomes a Unitarian. And he is most certainly the exception to the general rule of the chaplains from Robert Lee's army. He's the only one that I've found so far who has takes such a different path. Guys like Jones and Bennett and others become Francis Milton Kennedy from the 28th North Carolina. He ends up being the editor of the South Carolina Methodist newspaper. By and large, these guys who had been chaplains in Lee's army end up becoming stalwarts of the lost cause and stalwarts of post-war Southern society. So those are a few stories, and I think they're interesting insights into some of these men who lead Lee's religious efforts in Lee's army. And it helps us to see the connection between the pre-war religious world, the wartime experience, and then post-war religious world, because these guys do have long lasting influence and train generations of Baptist and Methodist Presbyterian leaders. So that's what I've got for today. We've got some more coming up on Saturday or on Sunday. As I said, Dr. Graham and I will be talking about J. William Jones. Excuse me, I'm not talking about J. William Jones. I'm going to talk about J.D. Renfro from the 10th Alabama, and a very important sermon that he gives. So thank y'all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you back here sooner rather than later, I hope. But everybody, please be safe. We got a long way to go before we're all ready to get together. So we'll keep doing these things. Pete and I will be for the members. Pete and I will be doing a member event later next week, and we look forward to continuing these conversations as we pass the months ahead of us. So y'all take care. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.
And next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, I'm going to be presenting on the United States Signal Corps at the Battle of Gettysburg. So we'll get a link started just for that in a few minutes. And then, yeah, we're going to keep doing these on Tuesday afternoons at 2 o'clock. So put that on your calendar and keep tuning in. So
Any questions come up, Pete, or no?
no, I didn't see any
Okay.
questions. And I wasn't able to post the pictures as you were talking, but I'm going to do it right after the video ends. So you'll see those pictures in a few minutes.
All right. Once
Thank you very
again,
much.
y'all take care. See you soon.